The hardest things to do for an interior design is come up with a decent lighting scheme, and then the second most difficult thing is to get that scheme to render using our computers. And so what I've done here, I've created a kind of a lighting sandbox where I can experiment with different fixtures and kind of demonstrate a few different techniques. And you'll want to choose which ones work for you or come up with your own. And I have a couple of fixtures here. You can actually copy and paste them right out of the drawing here and into your own projects, or you can load them in individually. I posted them all to Canvas. So first of all, one of the things I think I've mentioned before is you'll want to see the light sources that are in your light fixtures. One of the most common problems is you'll download something off of sketchy revitcomponents.com and there won't be a light source in the light fixture. Okay, and so this is displaying the light fixtures. Light sources will be the first thing. I'm just going to type in VG and bring up the visibility and graphic overrides, and I'll scroll down here to lighting fixtures and make sure that my light source is visible. And I think I might have mentioned you can override the colors of the lighting source just by clicking on the object there on the cell. Okay, so light sources are visible. I have shaded this. Just the hidden line view, the yellow lines just don't really do it for me. You can, of course, make the yellow lines into red lines if you don't like the shaded view, but I think it makes for a nicer video. And one of the things to notice is there's different kind of shapes to these light sources. First of all, these guys here are what are called studio lights. I think I mentioned in the previous video that studio lights are great if you kind of haven't decided what you want to do yet with your lighting. They just kind of make it light up, make the room light up. The shadows and the bright spots can be a little misleading. And here I have my own that I created called Brody Studio Omni Light, something like that. And there's different power. What you'll also see, all right, so these big circles here, this is a different type of light source. It's a light source which has an angle to it, and also it has sort of a beam and a sort of area around the beam. Let me show you the properties of the light fixture. I'll just edit the properties. And you see how it says 35 degree spot. Not every light fixture is going to have those definitions, but as you scroll down in the family properties, you'll see a number of things. There's the spot field angle, which is kind of like the spill light. And then the center of the beam, the brightest part, is going to be here in the spot beam angle. And you can also control the tilt. Okay, so you can't just sort of rotate these guys willy-nilly in section. The tilt angle, which is the angle off the ceiling plane, needs to be done in the menu. Okay. However, you can rotate them. So you see how I can select this particular fixture, and I can actually use the rotate tool. The rotate tool, by the way, you can click and drag on the center of rotation. So if you had to, move this fixture for some reason using some point other than the kind of, ceiling mounting location, you can use the rotate tool that way. Anyway, you won't be able to do that if you can't see the light sources. This is the only way to aim these fixtures. Let me go to my standard 3D view, the kind of axonometric view, and again show you, you can display the light sources in any view, and you can see the cones here. These are downlights. The biggest problem with light sources, again, is that either there is no light source, or if you zoom in on it, the light source is like inside some piece of solid geometry. Okay, so in this particular view here, I've created a ceiling with an uplight, just a standard ceiling component. I can nudge that light source up and down to make sure that it is not inside the ceiling. Okay, again, common problem. The other most common problem that I see is you have everything, it looks right, the light sources appear to be in the room, and it's still not lighting up. It might be that you have multiple ceilings. Okay, so what you can do in this section view, or if you tilt the model a little bit, you can use a crossing window, select everything, and then filter the selection so that you just have ceilings. Okay, and even here you'll see if there are more than one, that tells you, oh crap, I put a whole bunch of ceilings in there. Hit apply, and okay, and you can see it's selected. So if you have a whole bunch that are created by mistake, very easy with the automatic ceiling drawing tool. This is where you would want to delete them. Okay. Anyway, and I use these section view and in combination with the reflected ceiling plan view to really help me aim all these fixtures. These are downlights. Their main mission in life is to face down. That's why they're called downlights. And what you'll see here, they do have that cone of light. And let me just edit the type here. They also have a spot angle and a field angle. Okay, the beam angle and the field angle. The beam is where it's going to be brightest. Downlights are typically designed in the real world to have this kind of overlap area so that you always get an even light level. It is possible to get downlights which also wall wash, which I'll talk about in a moment. But it's very, very difficult to model that in Revit. Okay, so what I have done, I have created a number of studio lights, some of which are meant to be spotlights as well. Okay, so if you're like, geez, I want one of those, let me go back to my ceiling plan. Let's say you want a spotlight on this wall over here, but you just can't find a fixture that's working for you. You can load in, and I'll just go to Insert, Load Family, and then you'll want to browse to find your fixtures. I keep all of mine in a library. And you can see here I have a whole bunch of different fixtures, components, basically, that I've downloaded off of the internet. A lot of people will have a central library. Other people will just do it project by project. And certainly for you guys as students, I would say project by project makes the most sense. Click Open, and I will look for, what did I create? A studio spotlight. Okay, and you can see in the preview that there is that beam angle and then the field angle. I'll load that guy in. Okay, now one of the tricks is when you go to place the component, and I'm going to type in CM to load a component. Sometimes with studio lights, you won't see them when you insert them. I'm just going to click to place it, and let's see if it works. Oh, well, of course, it always works when I do it on the video. Studio lights are a little funny because the default ones come in kind of low, so you might want to do a number of things. First of all, in your ceiling plan, if you're just not seeing it, you might go and scroll down and turn on an underlay. Let me just go to where the underlay is. Here we go, underlay, and you might turn on level 1 and tell it to look down. Okay, and then anything that shows up in level 1, any components and any furniture that you might want to have will show up. I'm going to turn that off. You can also just go to level 1 floor plan, and if there is a component, and I have an underlay of the ceiling placed in here, that's why I'm seeing lighting. If the studio light happens to show up on the floor, and this is also true when you go to the Revit library, some of the other lighting components, they will not show up in ceiling, they'll show up in plan. Anyway, this studio light that I've created is awfully handy, and you can rotate it, and if I want to aim it on the wall, I can do like this. There's also different angles that I have set up here in this spotlight. for convenience. They're all at a 60-degree angle from the ceiling. So you can just choose them. As you choose them, you'll see that angle change. Okay. So an awfully handy fixture. So some of you might be saying, well, you know, I was trying to put lighting in my project and it wasn't working. Let me switch to our Sansi space building here. One trick that I use, we have an exposed floor structure up here. Okay, that's what the existing floor structure is. It's basically wooden decking. If you are so inclined, if you're exposing that structure, you would want to paint it with a material that looks like wood decking. However, some of you are the lighting won't work because it's a floor, not a ceiling. What you can do, if you go to the ceiling plan for the first floor, you can create a new ceiling. I'll just create ceiling, okay, and I'll do a sketched ceiling here. All right, and I can draw in my ceiling. And you can, by the way, have more than one rectangle at a time. And what I'm doing, I'm basically creating a fake ceiling. And I'm going to use this generic ceiling type. Okay, the generic ceiling type is basically almost completely thin. There's no geometry to it. You can't put recessed lights into this kind of roof, but this kind of floor structure. Or you might be able to, but probably not. So this fake ceiling, I'm going to put it right up next to the, here, I'll make this 11 feet so we can see it in the section. So I'll click the Finish Edit Mode, okay, and then let's go to our section drawing here and see if we can find that ceiling. And again, I've mentioned a couple of times that I like to use the section a lot, although, whoops, I guess I'm cutting away the floor. So here's the ceiling. See how it has no real thickness to it? And that's opposed to, say, a gypsum board ceiling or some other thing. The reason I like this is I can kind of sneak it in here and get it nice and high. Here's my floor structure. I can nudge this ceiling really close to the floor structure. Okay. Just remember, in this type of situation, you have an existing floor structure that cannot take recessed lights. So if you want to put recessed lights in here, you're going to have to build down from the existing structure, in which case I think I would use one of the other ceiling types, the gypsum board ceiling, to give yourself a little bit of space. Functionally, you need to run the wires somewhere. And in terms of Revit rendering, if you have this ceiling with recessed lights in it, the light source will actually show up inside the floor, and that doesn't work. Revit just won't allow you to have a light source in a floor. Okay, so that's how you can kind of make up for some issues with your not being able to put in any lighting at all. Now, in this case, in this sandbox room, I have plenty of light because I have a real ceiling. Now, one thing that is a little difficult to understand, sometimes when you load in families, they will be described in funny ways. So, for example, this one has two family types. There's a 100-watt, 120 volt, and a 277 volt. The reason that it has these different options, and you can see here this uplight strip, the same way, it has a length and then an option for 270 volts. The reason for this is these are common when you're doing kind of construction drawings. You're going to want to differentiate different types of lights. Often buildings are wired at a higher wattage, higher voltage, and so for the most part, you kind of ignore them. I would say as a rule, just have everything be 120 volts if there's an option. The light output will be exactly the same. Okay, but families that you load in, particularly from the Revit library, they're going to be a little difficult sometimes to understand what they're trying to accomplish. Again, I've provided a bunch of Brody families that you can use that are pretty easy. All right. So that's the basics of kind of Revit lighting families. Now let's talk a little bit about lighting design. Okay. Now there's a few light sources that you can use that kind of just get you what's called general lighting, and that's general with a capital G. And it's also sometimes referred to as volumetric lighting, where you're just trying to fill the space with light. And I would strongly recommend either using studio lights or depending on the type of ceiling, downlights, or let me go and put my component in here. Another one that works if it's say a 2x2 ceiling, you can use what are called troffers. Okay, and if you go here, troffer, lens, it has a bunch of options for wattage. But 2x2 or 2x4, that's the type of ceiling you have. When you go to place these, I'll just place this in here. You'll see it's basically a square or a rectangle, depending on the type of light source. And this will just fill the room with light, and they look like they're lighting up. They get a little bright. Okay, so that's kind of great for general lighting, and they don't look particularly fancy schmancy, but they work just fine. Okay. Downlights, one problem that you'll see with downlights is they often don't appear to be lighting up when you render. So I will warn you, if you're using, like I have my own fixtures here that I have created, what I've done, because sometimes it has to do with the type of light source in them, what I've done is created a material for these light sources. Go to the materials library. And it's called something like AB recessed can glow, something like that. If you're using a light fixture that isn't lighting up and you want it to appear to light up, use one of these glowing materials. And again, I went to the appearance menu and I just checked self-illumination, and then I checked the brightness that I want. LED screen is probably fine. Okay, or LED panel. Either one will make it look like it's glowing. And you can use that paint on other objects. So if you're creating, say, a custom light fixture, I don't know, here, let's go to floor plan. We'll create some kind of light source here. I'll just go to, massing. Well, here, we'll just mass in place component, model in place, and I'll just create a mass, and this is great if you're using a conceptual mass or something like that. Thank you, Revit, for showing masses, and we'll call it, weird lighting. When you're doing these masses, by the way, in place, make sure that you know which work plane you're on. And again, this we've kind of covered this, and I'll just create some kind of shape here in plan. This might actually look a lot better if we turn the light sources off. In this particular case, we'll just turn them off. There we go. That's better. And we'll allow this to be. Oops, I forgot to select this. All right. We'll create a form here. And what you'll see, actually, some of the features of the conceptual masses are available here. You can rotate surfaces. You can even move individual lines, individual points. One cool thing that you can do if you want, say, one part of this to be glowing, you can select the mass here. Let's select the mass. Okay. And a number of things, there are actually like many things, but you can do something like add a profile or add an edge. So for example, if I want this to have some part of it that is glowing, I can add these edges in here. Okay, let's select this again. If you want to add a profile in, that will add a horizontal kind of section to this thing. And here, let's add another one in. We'll make whatever, that's fine. Actually, what's cool about that too is that as you modify this thing, if you have a profile in there, it does actually kind of break the surface a little bit. So it allows you to create some pretty interesting forms. You know, each of these profiles or edge lines are kind of unique in that way. All right, so the whole point of this was to come in and use the paint bucket to apply a material. If you come in and you choose one of the glowing materials, you can paint just a section of this thing and you know, paint the other parts, whatever, some other, here we'll paint it blue. Okay, and what you'll see is, finish the mass here, that section should glow. Okay, and I'll just do a quick render to show you what that looks like. Exciting here in this low res render with most of the other lights off, but you can see that this panel is glowing. Okay, so let me just go back to where we were here. And actually, I don't particularly like this little dude, so I'm going to get rid of it. Okay, so that is some basic kind of general lighting, down lighting. Let's take a look at the ceiling plan again and talk about something called wall washing. Okay, and wall washing is a nice design feature, but it's a little hard to accomplish. Revit has some wall washers in the program, but they tend to make what are called scallops, which are not tasty little things that you get from the ocean. It's actually just annoying little scoops of light on the wall. I prefer a wall wash that has a nice even look to it. To do that, you need to use what's called an IES file. IES stands for Illuminating Engineering Society. And you don't need to know all the bits and pieces, but there is an IES file that I've created here. What that means, when I go to edit the family type, if you scroll down, instead of the light source having a cone of vision, it has a photometric web file. Okay, and if I select this thing and click the three dots, you will see that Revit actually comes with a whole bunch of these photometric web files, and this is a much more sophisticated way to show lighting. Something that's more complicated like wall washing needs these light sources. Okay, and you can see they look different. They look kind of like strange mushrooms. All right, and there are web files that can produce all sorts of light outputs. The general rule of thumb for wall washers is whatever the height of the wall, these wall washers should be 1/4 of that height away. So if this is a 10-foot wall, these should be 2.5 feet away. And you can see here that the light source is a circle. It's a recessed can. You can get these in square fixtures as well, but I don't have any. And they look really nice. Wall grazing is another type of lighting, which uses exactly the same type of light fixture, but it's much closer to the wall. And I'll show you some examples here of how this all looks in a few minutes. The rule of thumb here is that the distance of the light fixture is 1/8 of the wall height away. Okay, so a 10-foot wall, these would be a little over a foot away from the wall. Okay, they tend to make the material, the kind of roughness of the material show up very well. That would mean you'd have to create a material that looks really, that has a bump map in order for it to be interesting. Okay. Spotlights are another thing that really make for dramatic lighting. Like I mentioned, I have a spotlight that I created that's a Brody Omni spotlight that really has no geometry to it. Revit does come with some spotlight fixtures that work pretty well. Again, there's one in here that I've used that is a surface mounted spotlight, which will create bright light on one particular area of the angle that you specify. This one here is a recessed one. So if you're going with all recessed circles in your ceiling, this one will match that. Again, you're going to want to just rotate it in reflected ceiling plan. And if the light is spilling too much or not narrow enough, whatever, you can modify the properties to change the angles. So the last one that I'll talk about here is decorative lighting. And again, Revit has a bunch of families that are decorative. I think I have some sconces in here. They're table lamps, and you can create your own, which we did in class. The big thing with those, again, make sure that the light source is out of the geometry. Okay. Finally, and there is one other kind that I'll mention, task lighting. Task lighting is things like desk lamps. And again, you'll want to, if you have some task that you're trying to indicate, say a reading lamp in an otherwise fairly dark room, you'll want to either use a light fixture that has one of these cone-shaped light definitions, or you're going to want to just use one of these sources here, the studio lights that are angled. Okay. Now, you might say, well, that's all fine and dandy. What does all this stuff look like? Well, what I'm going to do, I have a couple of ready-made renderings here, so because it takes, obviously, a lot of time. And this is when I've rendered them, I've saved them to the project. So we can just take a quick look at them. First of all, if things are just kind of on, what you tend to get are kind of uneven lighting. See how this guy's kind of bright, she's kind of dark, these are kind of blotchy, these are kind of creating blobs on the ceiling. So out of the box, you're going to not really always get the greatest results. What you can do, let me go and we'll go back to one of these 3D views here. Go to balanced one. Whoa, hey, where'd it go? What you can do in every rendered view, you can kind of turn on and off or dim light fixtures. And it's actually surprisingly easy. If you go to the render menu, okay, and I'm using interior artificial only. When you go to the artificial lights button, okay, that will bring up a menu. Let me just stretch this out here. And it will indicate which lights are on in your view and their kind of dimming rate. Now, why they don't show this as a percentage, I don't know. I believe you can only have 0 to 1. So if I make this 0.1, okay, and again, it's a little hard to read, it doesn't look any different. And you'll notice, by the way, see how when I select the light, it highlights it here in the view. Very handy because sometimes these lights, if you have a million of them, you don't know which one is which. So this one will be 10% of its original strength. This is kind of a quick way to dim things in your project. You can also just turn them on and off just by kind of clicking on them and see how they become gray here. In the render menu. Okay, they don't look any different in this particular view. But when you click render or render region, those lights will be either dimmed or they will be turned off. These settings, by the way, allow you to create essentially scenes. So, for example, if I wanted to create a little more, oops, this is the 3D view. Let's go down to the view that is saved. Each of these are tied to the 3D view. So for example, if I wanted to highlight the weird sculpture, I can come in and in my render menu under artificial lights, I can basically turn everything off. You see how they're all kind of turned off, except for this one recess adjustable spot. Okay, and that's just tied to this particular view. Every other saved perspective view has different render settings. Okay. Anyway, as you can see, this is a much more dramatic view. I got a little wall wash, and I'm really highlighting this person, and she's kind of in the dark. Sorry about that. Hard to read. Guess I should have chosen a different light source. Anyway, there are many different ways you can kind of balance the lighting. For example, this is exactly the same lighting equipment. I haven't changed much, except that now I want this sculpture, which is supposed to glow or something like that, to be a little more prominent in the space. Okay. Again, these are design decisions, not sort of technology decisions. And again, look at the wall wash. See how nice and even it is? There's some minor scallops, but it's not too bright. It just creates a sense of room volume, all right? That can be really nice when you have high ceilings. So anyway, and I have a number of different ones where I've turned off all the other lights. See how this is the down lighting? It's looking a little blotchy. When you render on the cloud, you will find that it's not quite so blotchy. Usually you have the other lights on, okay? If I want to emphasize the painting, I think I don't have these aimed the right way here, so make those look a little nicer. Or the sconces, again, sometimes you'll want to just see, are these lights even working? Turning off all the lighting fixtures is the only way to do that, okay? And I have some views to the back here. This is the grazing lighting. It doesn't actually look all that different. But remember that when you render, you can adjust the exposure. Get rid of the bright highlights. Make those highlights a little darker. Otherwise, it will just be too bright for wall washing and grazing. You can also create lighting above a ceiling. And again, you can take a look at my model. That's that light fixture I was nudging up and down to be above the ceiling. Works pretty well. Not great, but it's all right. I also have some studio lights that either shine light up or shine light down. In this case, I also have two studio lights that are working back there. So anyway, there's all sorts of different effects that you can create here in rendering trick that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't work, but is worth a try. Is rendering your model to get a floor plan. Okay, so it's sometimes really nice to have a rendered floor plan. Usually your teacher will require it. First of all, I use the 3D view. See how it says 3D view down here? This is the standard Axon view. That's the default view. And you can use the view cube to put you in the top view. Because there's no perspective, you can see that it's a true floor plan. And this is the section box here. You can hide it or not. It doesn't really show up when you render. But one thing that you'll want to check is what's called the crop region, okay? And the crop region, I'm just going to show that. This is the box that we use to crop our interior elevations and other things. And if I tell it to crop the view, see how it crops away the plan? And you can actually use this to your advantage. You can set the crop region to really just show you the plan and not anything beyond. This will save you some rendering time. And kind of be a little irritating when you go to rotate the model. If I go to rotate the model, see, parts of it will disappear because of that crop region. So let me go back to the top view. What you'll want to do, first of all, let's get that back to where it was. What I like to do if I'm going to know I'm going to try rendering the plan, I will right-click on the 3D view and duplicate it. I usually do duplicate with detailing because I'm not really sure what else will happen. I believe it's if you have any detail lines and that sort of thing. And make a copy and call that plan. And I have it here. You can see it shows up in my 3D views. And what's nice about this is, first of all, sometimes you can get a halfway decent result. I'm just going to hide the crop region, okay? And I'm also going to hide this section box while I'm at it. Okay, hide view elements. First of all, if I just put it in realistic view, sometimes that's good enough to get you something you can render. Now my materials are a little dark, so I don't really think so. I'm going to go back to just a shaded view. Sometimes turning on the shadows, turn those on. Sometimes that will also be really nice. You see how it gives me a sense of depth, especially for this giant sculpture and these people. Okay, and you can export that image, file, export images here, and just export an image. And that will be something that you can use in Photoshop, for example. And I think those are pretty nice. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll just export a hidden line view with the shadows, and you can adjust the shadows, by the way, if you just click on the sun settings here and choose which angle they're coming from, for example. You see how that changes them. You can also change the altitude and azimuth, and again, it's not the most user-friendly thing, but oh, I guess I guess I gotta go the other direction. Whoops, oh well. Anyway, you can change the lighting settings to get something a little more dramatic. Let me turn those shadows off, though. Now, the other thing that you can do is try rendering this. Believe it or not, you can render these axonometric views, and you can render a true axon. And instructors will prefer an axon to a floor plan. I am one of them. But the trick is that the walls aren't going to render black. They're going to render gray. And that doesn't look quite as good in a floor plan. What you can do, you can select the walls, choose Edit Type, and then edit the structure. Okay, and what you'll see is that the structure can have a material applied to it. And I've created a material called AB Poche, which is basically just black, okay? And make sure that the render appearance is also black. And that is what my poche is going to look like, okay? And what you'll want to do is do that for every wall type that you have, and also for the floors, roofs, and ceilings if you want to try rendering the section. All right. Now, and finally, what I would strongly recommend when you go to render, we'll call it my render dialog box, rendering only works with 3D views, so that's why we can't just render our floor plan. And make sure you do a test run, see how it looks. The crop region in this instance doesn't really exactly define the size of it. What defines the size mostly is the scale. See how this is 1/4 inch scale? If I make it 1/8 inch scale, the plan effectively gets smaller. You'll just want to make sure that you check the crop region, that you're not rendering, a vast amount of empty space. Okay. Anyway, the other thing is when you're rendering plans, I have found varying results choosing either interior sun and artificial, or artificial only. So I've actually rendered all three for you. When you render these on your screen, it often shows up kind of dark and you'll have to adjust them quite a bit. I would absolutely recommend trying to render in the cloud just because these floor plans want to be very sharp. And rendering on the cloud is the only way that you're going to get enough resolution. So you'll have to try all three of these. Now, the other thing that you can try, and I actually don't recommend it, but I know that some people will want to try it. I don't know why you'll want to try it. You'll want to try it because you want to try it. If I look at my interior elevation, and again, this is the axonometric view that I have used to create a rendering of this section here, okay? And hopefully this will render really well. You can add in an image outside of these windows. Now, it never works for me, but I will show you how to do it. If you go to your rendering dialog box, you can choose what shows up outside of these windows, okay? I usually choose transparent and put the image in Photoshop because I don't really like the way it looks in Revit. But anyway, if you choose image and click the Customize Image button, that will allow you to browse for a picture. Okay, there you go, my lovely children. And you can control exactly how the image is processed. You can even offset it by moving it up or down. Okay, again, where Revit decides to place this is a little mysterious to me. Okay, click all right. And now when we render with that image in there, you should see it. Okay. Unfortunately, Revit doesn't allow you to see it until then. Let's take a look at these images in Photoshop, and we're not going to go too deep into it, but one thing you'll notice is that sometimes these images are super duper saturated. You can adjust that in Photoshop. I'll just click on the Adjustments menu, and one of these guys, I forget which one, is Hue and Saturation. And what I like to do, and again, you can do this online with the adjustment tools in Revit, or you can do it here in Photoshop. I find that often I'm using Photoshop to fix things. And you see how that's just a little bit easier on the eye. And remember that printing is always going to be, you're going to want to do a test print no matter what you do. But these Photoshop adjustments can really help. So let's take a look at some of these other ones. The view to the back, you can see that this was the higher quality rendered image that we created. View to the front, and you can see looming in the distance are my giant children. So when I rendered it without that image, this is transparent, and now what you can do is you can import that image. It's called placing. I'll just place embedded. and find the image file of those kiddos. Okay, and what the advantage of doing it this way, I'll just click the check mark to accept this. Let me go to my layers menu and see how there are these layers that are created by the different elements. I can drag my children around, and now they're below the image here of the space. And you see how it neatly crops away everything else based on the transparency of the windows. And then I can come in, and if I want these, they're a little too much. I will fade them out a little bit. Okay, you will get this kind of checkerboard pattern here. The checkerboard is Photoshop's way of handling transparency. So if you want to get rid of that, go to the File menu and look for the Preferences. Oh, I'm sorry, under Photoshop, look for Preferences, and it's under Transparency. And some people prefer to run with no transparency, and now you get a better sense of what those images outside of the window will look like. Okay, I'll just turn it off, turn it on. I like to have the little checkerboard in there just so I know that my transparency is working. So the one, and that's a great idea. You can also crop in Photoshop if you want to get rid of kind of the outer region here. And you see Photoshop is pretty smart generally about finding kind of the boundaries of the image. And there are many, many more things that you can do in Photoshop, of course. But the last thing you want to do, if you're just going to drop this puppy straight into InDesign, and I am not a big fan of InDesign. It's great when you're creating a book, but not so great if you're doing boards. I prefer Adobe Illustrator, but either way, you'll want to check the resolution of this, particularly if you're going to InDesign. You just go to Image, Image Size, okay? And what you're checking for is this number here, resolution. Okay, usually we print at 200 pixels per inch, but the images as they come out of Revit are 72. So when you drop that on your board, if you don't change the size of it, it will look all pixelated. So you need to change this to 200 pixels per inch. You see how the image size got smaller. It's squishing those pixels into less space, which means that it's going to be sharper. But it also means that it's going to be a problem. It's going to be smaller. So anyway, if you want it to be the same size, so for example, when it comes out of Revit, it's going to be, it may be to scale, although not always. We often lose the scale when we do it. You'd want to click this resample button. Okay, I will warn you, this can create some pretty big file sizes, and it kind of can make it blurry sometimes. So I usually leave it off and just change the resolution like that. You won't see any difference when you click OK, but when you drag this puppy onto InDesign or even Illustrator, it will process the image differently. And that's the basics of rendering using Revit and some custom lighting settings.